CEO came to his adopted black daughter's school. At lunch, what he witnessed shocked him. A powerful young CEO decides to surprise his quiet adopted daughter at school, expecting a smile, maybe a wave from across the room. Instead, he freezes. His daughter is standing alone, while other kids mock her food, her hair, even her last name. What's worse? An adult is watching, and doing nothing. He doesn't step in. He sits down. And that's when he realizes this isn't a one-time moment. It's a daily humiliation his daughter has been carrying in silence. That night, he uncovers something far darker: ignored complaints, buried reports, and a system designed to look the other way. So he comes back the next week, not as a father, but as the man who funds half the district. The question is, will exposing the truth protect his child, or make her the biggest target of all? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the kitchen as Caleb Thornton stood at the granite counter, watching his daughter meticulously arrange her breakfast cereal. 8-year-old Imani lined up each piece of fruit on her napkin with careful precision. First the strawberries, then the blueberries, smallest to largest. Her small fingers worked with deliberate focus, as if this simple morning routine required all her concentration. "Everything okay there, sweetheart?" Caleb asked, sipping his coffee. Imani nodded without looking up. "Yes, Daddy." Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Caleb studied her over the rim of his mug. The morning light caught the dark curls she'd pulled back into neat braids she'd insisted on redoing twice already. Her school uniform was spotless, every pleat of her navy skirt lying perfectly straight. Even her shoelaces were tied with exactly the same length on each side. This wasn't new behavior, but something about it made Caleb's chest tighten. He remembered the day 2 years ago when he'd first met Imani at the children's home. She'd been just as quiet then, but her eyes had held a spark of hope when she looked at him. That spark had led him to make a promise, not just on paper, but in his heart, that she would always feel safe and loved. "Do you want me to pack you an extra snack today?" he offered, already reaching for her favorite crackers. "No, thank you," she replied politely. "I have enough." Caleb watched as she carefully wrapped her half-eaten toast in a napkin and placed it in the trash, though he knew she usually finished every bite. His parental instincts hummed with concern. The drive to school was quiet, save for the soft rhythm of rain starting to fall. Through the rearview mirror, Caleb observed Imani staring out the window, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. The closer they got to school, the more those hands twisted together. "Hey," he said gently as they pulled up to the drop-off zone. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Imani met his eyes in the mirror for a brief moment. "I know, Daddy." She gave him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As she climbed out of the car, Caleb noticed how she squared her shoulders, like a tiny soldier heading into battle. The image stayed with him as he drove to work, nagging at the edges of his mind during meetings and conference calls. Throughout his day at the office, Caleb found himself distracted. Between reviewing quarterly reports and attending budget meetings, his thoughts kept drifting back to Imani's careful movements, her quiet voice, the way she seemed to be making herself smaller somehow. "Everything all right, Mr. Thornton?" his assistant asked after he'd missed a question during the afternoon staff meeting. "Yes, just thinking about some important matters," he replied, straightening his tie and refocusing on the presentation. But even as he directed his attention to profit margins and marketing strategies, part of him was remembering the day he'd signed Imani's adoption papers. He'd promised himself then that being a father would always come first, before any business success. Looking at the corporate empire he'd built from nothing, he knew he had the power to solve most problems, but something told him this situation required more than just his usual confident authority. The evening routine went as usual: dinner, homework, bath time. But Caleb noticed every detail with new awareness. How Imani checked her backpack 3 times before setting it by the door. How she laid out her uniform for the next day with painstaking care. How she asked to go to bed 15 minutes early, something she'd never done before. After tucking her in and reading their usual story, Caleb kissed her forehead and moved towards the door. He was about to switch off the light when he heard it, a whispered prayer so quiet he almost missed it. "Dear God!" Imani's voice trembled slightly in the darkness. "Please help me be strong tomorrow at school." Caleb's hand froze on the light switch. His throat tightened as he listened to the soft words of his daughter's prayer. In that moment, he felt the weight of his promise to protect her press against his heart with new urgency. Something was wrong, and despite all his success and power in the business world, he felt suddenly uncertain about how to fix it. He stood there for a long moment, watching Imani's small form under her butterfly-patterned comforter, hearing her breathing even out as she drifted toward sleep. The night light cast gentle shadows on her peaceful face, but her earlier prayer echoed in his mind, carrying a weight that would follow him into his own restless evening. The soft glow of dawn crept through the kitchen windows as Caleb prepared breakfast, the familiar rhythm of their morning routine settling over the house. 2 plates of scrambled eggs, whole wheat, toast and fresh orange slices, just the way Imani liked it. But something felt different today. The usual morning peace felt heavy, charged with an uncertainty that made his shoulders tense. Imani appeared in the doorway, her backpack already perfectly arranged on her small shoulders. Her uniform was pristine. She'd taken extra care with her collar, making sure it lay perfectly flat. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids, not a strand out of place. "Good morning, sweetheart," Caleb said, setting her plate at her usual spot. "I added extra cinnamon to your toast." "Thank you," she replied softly, climbing onto her chair. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. Caleb watched as she picked at her eggs, moving them around the plate more than eating them. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each minute bringing them closer to school drop-off. His mind wandered back to her whispered prayer from the night before. "Looking forward to anything special at school today?" He tried, keeping his voice light. Imani's fork paused briefly. "It's fine," she said, the same response she always gave. Her eyes remained fixed on her plate, shoulders curved inward ever so slightly. The drive to school was quiet, save for the soft hum of morning radio. In the rearview mirror, Caleb noticed how Imani's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window. When they arrived, she gave him a quick hug, too quick, and walked into the building with measured steps. At his office, Caleb found himself struggling to focus on the quarterly reports spread across his desk. His email pinged with the weekly school newsletter, its cheerful font announcing, "Building our community together." The message was filled with bright photos of smiling children and bullet points about inclusion and respect. Our values center around creating a safe and nurturing environment where every child can thrive, the principal's message declared. Caleb's jaw tightened as he read the words, remembering Imani's whispered prayer and tense shoulders. When 3 o'clock came, he left work early, something he rarely did. The afternoon pickup line seemed to crawl. Finally, Imani appeared, climbing into the back seat with a quiet, "Hello." Her face was composed, but there was something in her eyes that made his heart ache. At home, while Imani worked on her homework at the kitchen table, Caleb noticed her lunchbox sitting by the sink. Opening it, he found the sandwich untouched, the apple uneaten, everything exactly as he'd packed it that morning. "Weren't you hungry at lunch, sweetheart?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. I just wasn't very hungry, she said, not looking up from her math worksheet. Her pencil moved across the paper with careful precision, each number formed perfectly. Later that evening, during their usual bath time routine, Caleb helped Imani wash her hair. As he reached to pour the cup of warm water over her head, she flinched, just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough to make his hand freeze mid-air. The movement was instinctive, like a reflex born from something she wasn't telling him. Is the water too hot? He asked, though he knew that wasn't it. No, it's okay, she said quickly. Too quickly. She sat perfectly still as he finished rinsing her hair, her small hands gripping the edge of the tub. That night, long after Imani had gone to bed, Caleb lay awake in his room. The house was quiet, but his mind was loud with thoughts he couldn't silence. He thought about how carefully Imani always spoke, how precisely she moved, how perfectly she maintained her composure. He'd always attributed it to shyness, to her naturally gentle personality. But now, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, a different understanding began to take shape. This wasn't shyness. This wasn't just her quiet nature. This was something else entirely, a carefully constructed shield, a daily exercise in endurance. His little girl was carrying something heavy, something she didn't feel she could share. The realization sat like a stone in his chest. How long had she been bearing this silence? How many mornings had she walked into that school, shoulders squared, carrying whatever burden she was hiding? The thought of her facing each day with such careful courage made his throat tight. He remembered the day he'd adopted her, how he'd promised to keep her safe, to give her the stability she deserved. He'd focused on providing everything she needed, a warm home, good food, the best education. But now, lying in the dark, he realized that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought against obvious enemies. Sometimes they were fought in silence, in carefully measured words and uneaten lunches, in prayers whispered into pillows when no one else could hear. Sleep remained elusive as the clock ticked past midnight. The moonlight cast shadows on his wall, and somewhere in the quiet house, his daughter slept, or perhaps lay awake like him, carrying her own heavy thoughts. Tomorrow would come with its morning routine, its packed lunches, its careful conversations. But now that he recognized her silence for what it was, everything would look different in the morning light. The morning sun cast long shadows across Caleb's desk as he stared at his phone calendar. Meeting after meeting filled the screen in neat, organized blocks. With determined fingers, he pressed cancel on each one. His assistant's concerned voice crackled through the intercom almost immediately. Mr. Thornton, is everything all right with today's schedule? Something's come up, he said simply, his voice steady despite the worry gnawing at his chest. Family matter. The drive to Oak Ridge Elementary took exactly 12 minutes. Caleb knew this because he'd driven Imani there every morning for the past year, watching her small figure disappear through those red brick doors. Today felt different. He parked his black sedan in the visitor's lot, straightening his tie more out of habit than necessity. The school's front office hummed with typical weekday activity. A parent ahead of him signed in a late student, while another collected a sick child. Caleb stepped up to the desk, offering his most casual smile. Here to have lunch with my daughter, he said smoothly. The secretary barely glanced up, sliding a visitor's badge across the counter. Parents coming for lunch wasn't unusual. That's exactly what he was counting on. The cafeteria's double doors loomed ahead, the sounds of children's voices growing louder with each step. Caleb checked his watch. 12:15. Lunch period had just begun. He slipped inside, letting himself blend into the background near a wall decorated with student artwork. That's when he saw her. Imani stood in the lunch line, her purple backpack hanging slightly crooked on her small shoulders. Her hands gripped her lunch tray so tightly her knuckles seemed to pale against her dark skin. The sight of her tension made Caleb's throat tighten. "Look who it is. Silent girl." A sharp voice cut through the cafeteria noise. A group of students near the front tables snickered. "Hey, Thornton, why don't you ever talk? Cat got your tongue?" Imani's shoulders hunched slightly, but she didn't respond. She took one careful step forward in line. "What's in your lunch today? Bet it's weird like yesterday." Another voice called out. More laughter followed. Caleb's hands clenched at his sides. Every fiber of his being wanted to step forward, to stop this immediately. But years of business negotiations had taught him the value of watching, of gathering information. So he stood, heart aching, and observed. "Those braids look like spider legs." A girl with blonde pigtails pointed and giggled. "And what kind of last name is Thornton for someone like her, anyway?" Near the lunch counter, Darlene Whitcomb sorted through her purse, seemingly absorbed in finding her wallet. She glanced up briefly at the comments, then back down, her lips pressing into a thin line. She was close enough to hear every word, yet she didn't move. Imani reached the front of the line. Her lunch tray trembled slightly as she tried to balance it. Someone bumped into her from behind, not quite accidentally, making her stumble forward. "Oops," came the mock-innocent voice. "Didn't see you there. You're so quiet. You're practically invisible." Caleb watched as his daughter, his brave, gentle daughter, steadied herself without a word. Her face remained carefully blank, but he recognized the slight quiver in her chin, the same one he'd seen last night during her bedtime prayer. Mrs. Whitcomb finally looked up, scanning the cafeteria with tired eyes. "Everyone find your seats," she called out half-heartedly, before turning back to her lunch purchase. The children dispersed, still giggling, still throwing glances at Imani. She stood for a moment, tray in hand, looking at the sea of tables before her. Every seat seemed to fill up instantly, backs turning, spaces closing like doors being shut. Caleb's chest burned with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. This wasn't just one bad day. This wasn't just kids being kids. This was systematic exclusion, happening right under the watchful eyes of adults who chose not to watch too carefully. Finally, Imani made her way to a corner table, empty except for a few forgotten napkins. She sat down with the same careful precision she showed at home, arranging her food with quiet dignity. Her eyes stayed focused on her tray, never lifting to meet the occasional pointing or whispered comments from nearby tables. Mrs. Whitcomb walked past, carrying her own lunch, heading toward the teacher's table. She glanced at Imani sitting alone, hesitated for just a moment, then continued walking. Caleb stood rooted to his spot, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to do: sweep in and take Imani home, confront the teacher, call every parent of every child who had spoken unkindly. But he also knew that quick actions driven by anger rarely led to lasting solutions. His daughter needed more than just a rescue. She needed change. The cafeteria buzzed with the normal chaos of elementary school lunch, laughing, talking, the clatter of plastic trays and the rustle of paper bags. But in that corner, his daughter sat in a bubble of isolation, carefully eating her lunch one small bite at a time, her shoulders straight despite their invisible burden. She was 8 years old, bearing a weight no child should have to carry, and she bore it with a grace that made his heart simultaneously swell with pride and break with sorrow. Caleb watched as she methodically finished her lunch, noting how she kept her movements small and contained, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. When she finally stood to clear her tray, she moved with that same careful precision he'd noticed at home, the kind that comes from trying to avoid attention, from trying to be invisible. Caleb's hands gripped the edge of his cafeteria table, knuckles turning white. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he watched his daughter stand alone, her small frame rigid with tension. Other children filled the seats around her, but the space near Imani remained conspicuously empty, like an invisible wall surrounded her. A girl with blonde pigtails wrinkled her nose. "Oh, what's that smell? Is that your food again?" "It's curry," another child called out. "My mom says it stinks up the whole room." Caleb noticed how Imani's fingers tightened around her lunch tray, her knuckles pale against the bright blue plastic. She didn't respond, didn't look up, didn't move. Just stood there, enduring, as if she'd learned that stillness was safer than motion. Mrs. Whitcomb, the teacher on lunch duty, glanced up briefly from her phone. Her eyes swept over the scene before, returning to her screen, dismissing the interaction as simple childhood chatter. Caleb watched in disbelief as she absently stirred her coffee, paying more attention to her social media than the cruelty unfolding before her. "Hey, Thorny," a boy called out, emphasizing the cruel nickname. "Why's your hair always look like that? Can't your dad afford a brush?" Caleb's chest tightened. The protective braids he carefully helped maintain each week, a skill he'd specifically learned for Imani, had become another target for their mockery. He remembered how proudly Imani had smiled when he first managed to complete a proper braid, how she'd hugged him and said it was perfect even though they both knew it was crooked. A group of girls walked past Imani, deliberately bumping her tray. Water sloshed from her cup, wetting the sleeve of her carefully pressed uniform shirt. Not one of them apologized. Not one adult noticed. Or rather, Caleb realized with growing horror, they chose not to notice. This wasn't random. The calculated nature of the interactions, the practiced way Imani absorbed each blow, this was a daily ritual. His daughter wasn't just having a rough day or week. She was surviving a gauntlet of small cruelties over and over again. Caleb's leg tensed, ready to stand. His paternal instinct screamed at him to march over there, to shield his child, to demand answers from that negligent teacher. But just then, Imani's eyes lifted and met his across the cafeteria. The look in those deep brown eyes stopped him cold. There was recognition, then fear, then something that broke his heart, a quiet, desperate plea. She gave the tiniest shake of her head, so slight anyone else would have missed it. But Caleb knew his daughter's unspoken language. She was begging him, "Please don't make it worse. Please let me handle this." His daughter, his 8-year-old child, was asking him to let her carry this burden alone. Caleb sank back in his chair, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. Every fiber of his being rebelled against honoring that request, against watching his little girl weather this storm without intervention. But he recognized something in her silent plea, a dignity she was fighting to maintain, a strength she was determined to prove to herself. He remained seated, each second an eternity of helpless witness. Imani finally found an empty corner table, setting her tray down with careful precision. She ate small, measured bites, her movements deliberately quiet and contained, as if trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. The other children's laughter echoed off the walls, but she might as well have been sitting in a bubble of silence. The lunch bell rang, its harsh buzz startling in the cacophony of scraping chairs and rising voices. Caleb watched as Imani stood, robotically carrying her tray to the garbage bins. More than half her lunch went into the trash, another daily ritual, he realized. How many meals had she missed? How many times had she gone hungry rather than face this battlefield disguised as a cafeteria? Students streamed past him toward their next classes, but Caleb couldn't move. He sat there long after the room emptied, staring at the corner table where his daughter had sat. The janitor began sweeping between the tables, giving him curious glances, but Caleb barely noticed. Finally, his legs carrying him without conscious thought, he made his way to the parking lot. The midday sun was bright and cheerful, mockingly at odds with the darkness he felt inside. He unlocked his car door and slid behind the wheel, but couldn't bring himself to start the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, gripping it too tightly. All his success, all his carefully built power and influence, meant nothing in the face of his daughter's silent suffering. Imani had learned to make herself invisible, to shrink and fade and endure, and he, her father, her protector, had missed it completely. The truth hit him with devastating clarity. His daughter didn't just know how to disappear. She had perfected it into an art form, a survival strategy so well crafted that even he, who loved her more than life itself, hadn't recognized it until now. She had been vanishing right before his eyes, piece by piece, day by day. Caleb stared through the windshield, seeing not the school building before him, but all the quiet mornings, all the careful movements, all the gentle deflections that suddenly made horrible sense. His daughter had been trying to protect him from her pain, carrying it with a grace that no child should have to possess. His chest ached with a mixture of pride at her strength and devastation at its necessity. The car remained still in the parking lot, a silent witness to a father's heart breaking for his child, and the moment when he realized that sometimes the greatest courage isn't in fighting back, it's in seeing, truly seeing, what your loved ones endure in silence. The cafeteria's fluorescent lights had long since dimmed to afternoon shadows by the time Caleb finally turned his key in the ignition. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, the image of Imani sitting alone burning in his mind. The drive home felt longer than usual, each traffic light giving him more time to replay what he'd witnessed. At home, he moved through his evening routine mechanically, checking emails, reviewing documents, preparing dinner. The kitchen filled with the familiar aroma of baked chicken and rice, but his thoughts remained in that school cafeteria. When Imani came home, she followed her usual pattern. Homework first, then helping to set the table, everything done with quiet precision. They sat down to dinner together, steam rising from their plates in the comfortable silence of their kitchen. Caleb watched as Imani carefully arranged her food, taking small, measured bites. The way she handled her fork, so deliberately, so cautiously, reminded him of how she'd held her lunch tray earlier that day. "Imani," he said softly, setting down his own fork. "Can we talk about lunch?" She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. Recognition flickered across her face. She knew he had been there. Her small shoulders tensed, then relaxed, as if letting go of a weight she'd carried too long. "The other kids," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "They say my food is weird." Her fingers traced patterns on the tablecloth. "Yesterday I brought jollof rice, like how Ms. Ada taught you to make. They said it smelled funny." Caleb's throat tightened. Ms. Ada, their elderly neighbor, had spent countless evenings teaching him traditional recipes so Imani could taste the flavors of her heritage. "And," Imani continued, her words careful and measured, like she was handling something fragile, "they don't like my hair. They say it's too much, too different." She touched one of her braids, the beads clicking softly. "Jasmine said nobody would want to be friends with someone who looks like me." The matter-of-fact way she spoke those words hit Caleb harder than any anger could have. There was no outrage in her voice, no tears, just quiet acceptance, as if she was simply stating that the sky was blue or water was wet. "How long has this been happening?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "Since the beginning of school," she replied, pushing a piece of chicken around her plate. "But it's okay, Daddy. I pray about it." Caleb felt his heart crack a little more. His daughter shouldn't have to pray for strength just to eat lunch at school. "You know none of what they say is true, right?" he said, reaching across the table to cover her small hand with his. Imani nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on her plate. "I know, but sometimes—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes knowing doesn't make it easier." They finished dinner talking about lighter things. Her math test, the book she was reading, the cardinal that had visited their bird feeder that morning. But Caleb noticed how she ate every bite of her food, as if making up for the lunch she couldn't finish at school. Later that night, as Caleb helped Imani get ready for bed, she knelt beside her bed as she always did. Her small hands clasped together, head bowed over her purple comforter. "Dear God," she began, her voice clear and steady in the quiet room. "Thank you for Daddy, and for our home, and for Ms. Ada next door." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Please help me be brave again tomorrow. Help me remember what Daddy says about being strong on the inside. And please help the other kids understand that different isn't bad." Caleb stood in the doorway, his heart both swelling with pride and aching with pain. His daughter wasn't asking for the bullying to stop, or for new friends, or even for help. She was asking for courage to face another day. After tucking her in and kissing her good night, Caleb stepped into the hallway. He remained there, one hand pressed against her bedroom door, listening to her soft breathing. The family photos lining the wall seemed to watch him. Snapshots of birthdays, holidays, ordinary moments made special by their shared love. Standing there in the dim hallway light, Caleb understood with crushing clarity that watching from the sidelines was no longer enough. His daughter's quiet endurance wasn't a sign of strength, it was a cry for help. She had learned to make herself small, to swallow her pain, to pray for courage instead of change. And he had been missing it, mistaking her silence for adjustment, her politeness for peace. The weight of this realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Being a witness to her pain wasn't enough anymore. Protecting her wasn't just about providing a safe home or material comfort. It was about standing up for her dignity, about teaching her that she deserved better than quiet endurance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the school's parking lot as Caleb's car pulled up to the drop-off zone. He watched Imani gather her backpack, her movements careful and measured like always. His heart ached knowing what she would face today. "Have a good day, sweetheart," he said softly. Imani gave him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You too, Dad." As she walked toward the entrance, her braids swaying gently with each step, Caleb made his decision. Instead of heading to his office, he parked his car and walked straight to the school's main entrance. The front desk receptionist looked up with practiced cheerfulness. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "I'm Caleb Thornton, Imani Thornton's father. I'd like to review her student records and any incident reports involving her class." The receptionist's smile flickered slightly. "Oh, well, that requires proper authorization and advance notice." "I'm aware of FERPA regulations," Caleb said quietly but firmly. "As Imani's legal guardian, I have the right to review her educational records. I can wait while you verify my ID and prepare the documents." 20 minutes later, Caleb sat in a small conference room, surrounded by manila folders and documentation. His laptop was open, and he methodically began taking notes. Hours passed as he combed through report after report. What he found made his stomach turn. Incident reports were marked with vague descriptions. Lunch period disagreement. Student conflict resolved through peer mediation. Cultural misunderstanding addressed. The resolution sections were even more troubling. Students counseled. Situation monitored. No further action required. Caleb created a spreadsheet, tracking dates, participants, and outcomes. A pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. When certain students reported problems, particularly children of color like Imani, their concerns were consistently downplayed or dismissed. The same harmful behaviors were labeled as misunderstandings rather than bullying or harassment. His phone buzzed with meeting reminders throughout the day, but he had his assistant reschedule everything. This was more important. By early afternoon, his eyes were tired from reading, but his resolve had only grown stronger. One report particularly stood out. 3 months ago, Imani had quietly told Ms. Whitcomb that some girls kept touching her hair without permission. The teacher's response was documented as, "Suggested student could wear different hairstyle to avoid drawing attention." Caleb had to step outside for fresh air after reading that one. He stood in the parking lot, breathing deeply, his hands clenched at his sides. When he returned, he requested the school's anti-bullying policies and diversity training materials. The resulting stack of papers was thin and clearly outdated. As the school day wound down, he gathered his notes and headed home. The house was quiet when Imani arrived from the bus. She found him in his home office, surrounded by papers and sticky notes covered in his neat handwriting. "Can I draw in here while you work?" she asked softly. "Of course, sweetheart." He cleared a space on the corner of his desk, where she could sit and still be close to him. Imani settled in with her sketchbook and colored pencils. The scratch of her pencils mixed with the sound of Caleb's typing as he organized his findings. Every so often, he would glance at her, this precious, resilient child who had learned to make herself small in hopes of avoiding notice. The sky outside grew darker as evening approached. Imani's drawings took shape. Beautiful, colorful patterns that spoke of the creativity she held inside. Caleb's documentation took shape too, but it painted a much darker picture. Looking at his spreadsheet, he saw more than just numbers and dates. He saw a system that had failed his daughter and children like her. This wasn't simple negligence or overworked teachers unable to catch everything. The pattern was too consistent, the oversights too selective. "Imani," he said softly, "would you like to order pizza for dinner?" She looked up from her drawing and nodded. "Can we get the one with extra cheese?" "Absolutely." As he placed the order on his phone, the truth he'd been circling all day finally crystallized in his mind. This wasn't just a series of unfortunate incidents or overwhelmed staff missing important cues. This was systemic bias, deeply rooted in the school's culture and policies, affecting how certain children's experiences were valued or devalued. He watched Imani add another careful line of color to her drawing. His daughter deserved better. All the children did. The documentation spread across his desk wasn't just paper, it was evidence of a system that needed to change. Caleb began a new document, typing slowly and deliberately. Formal complaint and request for investigation. The words felt heavy with purpose. This wouldn't be a quick fix, but it would be a start. Because sometimes love meant more than just comforting your child. It meant standing up and demanding better for all children. The multipurpose room at Oakwood Elementary buzzed with quiet conversation as parents filed in for the monthly Parent-Teacher Association meeting. Caleb chose a seat in the middle rows, deliberately blending in with the crowd rather than taking his usual place near the front, where board members and prominent donors typically sat. He wore a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual suit, leaving his CEO persona behind. The room smelled of coffee and sugar cookies, laid out on a folding table near the entrance. Parents chatted in small groups, their voices creating a gentle hum beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Caleb noticed how they naturally clustered, the fundraising committee members together, the room parents in another corner, and a handful of parents sitting alone, including a woman he would soon know as Tonya Reeves. Principal Matthews called the meeting to order with practiced cheerfulness. Welcome, everyone. We have such exciting updates about our spring carnival fundraiser. She beamed at the room, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced enthusiasm that Caleb had come to recognize from the school's newsletters. The meeting proceeded through its agenda: budget reports, upcoming events, volunteer sign-ups. Caleb took careful notes, not of the content, but of the dynamics. Who spoke? Who was heard? Who was politely rushed along? During the open forum portion, Tonya Reeves raised her hand. She sat straight-backed in her chair, wearing neat business casual attire that suggested she'd come directly from work. "I'd like to discuss the ongoing concerns about bullying during lunch periods," she said, her voice steady but careful. "Several parents have reported incidents that don't seem to be getting addressed." Principal Matthews's smile never wavered. "Thank you for bringing that up, Mrs. Reeves. I want to assure everyone that we take all reports very seriously. Our staff is fully trained in conflict resolution." "With respect," Tonya continued, "taking reports seriously isn't the same as acting on them. My son has been targeted repeatedly, and the only response I've received is that the situation has been noted." A slight tension crept into the principal's voice. "We follow all district protocols for investigating such incidents. Perhaps we could discuss your specific concerns after the meeting." Caleb watched as other parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He recognized the careful dance of words. How investigating didn't mean solving. How discussing after the meeting really meant dismissing in private. "I've tried discussing it privately." Tonya pressed on. "Multiple times. The problem isn't just with my child. There's a pattern here that needs to be addressed openly. We appreciate your passion for student welfare." Principal Matthews responded smoothly. "Now, about our spring carnival plans." Caleb noticed how quickly the topic changed, how efficiently Tonya's concerns were wrapped in polite acknowledgement and set aside. He saw other parents, mostly minorities, nodding slightly at Tonya's words while remaining silent themselves. The meeting moved on, but the undercurrent of unaddressed issues remained palpable. After the meeting, Caleb drove home, his mind processing everything he'd witnessed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as he pulled into his driveway. Today was a half day at school, and Imani had already been picked up by their trusted housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. He found them in the kitchen, Imani sitting at the counter while Mrs. Chen tidied up from lunch. "Dad." Imani's face brightened. "Can we bake something? Mrs. Chen said we have all the ingredients for chocolate chip cookies." The simple request, delivered with such hope, made his heart squeeze. "Of course we can, sweetheart. I can't think of a better way to spend the afternoon." Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly as she gathered her things to leave. "Everything you need is on the counter. Have fun, you two." Once they were alone, Caleb and Imani fell into their familiar baking routine. He helped her measure flour while she cracked eggs with careful concentration. The kitchen filled with the homey scent of vanilla extract and butter. "Remember how we used to do this every Friday?" Imani asked, stirring the dough with determined focus. "I do," Caleb replied, watching her work. "We got pretty good at it, didn't we?" "Yeah." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I like when we bake together. It feels like everything's okay." Caleb felt the weight of those words. He helped her scoop dough onto baking sheets, noting how precise she was with each portion. "You know what I like about baking," he said softly. "How it takes time. How you have to pay attention and really listen to know when things are ready." Imani nodded, seeming to understand that he meant more than just cookies. "Sometimes things need more time than the recipe says," she offered quietly. "That's exactly right." He helped her slide the first batch into the oven. "And that's okay." They spent the afternoon baking, talking about small things, favorite flavors, funny cooking show moments, whether chocolate chips were better than M&Ms in cookies. With each batch, Imani's shoulders relaxed a little more. Her laugh came easier. She moved around their kitchen with growing confidence, proud of her developing skills. As they sat together at the kitchen island, sharing warm cookies and cold milk, Caleb watched his daughter's face. She was humming softly to herself, legs swinging freely beneath her chair. It was the most relaxed he'd seen her in weeks. The afternoon had given her something she desperately needed, a safe space to just be herself. Crumbs scattered across the counter as Imani broke another cookie in half, offering him the bigger piece. The simple gesture of sharing, of trust, reminded him powerfully of what he'd witnessed at the meeting. Sometimes the most important things were said in the smallest actions. In a mother raising her voice despite knowing she'd be dismissed, in a child offering half her cookie even after learning that sharing could make her vulnerable. The kitchen was warm with the lingering heat of the oven and rich with the smell of baked cookies. Through the window, the afternoon sun painted everything in soft gold. Imani's smile, free and genuine, told him more than any school report ever could about what really mattered. Monday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. Caleb adjusted his tie, watching Imani eat her breakfast. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't rushing through her meal or sitting with tense shoulders. "Ready for a new week?" he asked, pouring himself a second cup of coffee. Imani nodded, her braids swaying. "I packed extra carrots today," she said, patting her lunch bag. "And my math homework is all done." The weekend had been busy for Caleb. After careful consideration, he'd drafted a proposal for a student mentoring program, complete with anti-bullying initiatives and cultural awareness activities. He'd signed the checks himself, ensuring the school had resources for training and materials. When they pulled up to the school, Principal Stevens was waiting at the entrance, greeting students. Her smile widened as Caleb and Imani approached. "Mr. Thornton, thank you again for your generous support," she said, extending her hand. "We're implementing the new programs this week." Caleb shook her hand firmly. "I'm glad to help. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to take the first step." Inside the school, teachers who had previously seemed distant now smiled warmly at Imani. Mrs. Whitcomb, her homeroom teacher, had already set up a buddy system for class projects, ensuring no student worked alone. During lunch that day, Ruth Ann Calder, one of the cafeteria aides, approached Imani's table. Her kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "Sweetheart," Ruth Ann said softly, "I saved you a spot at table 4. Sarah and Marcus are there. They're working on the science fair project, too." Imani looked up at Ruth Ann, then at her father, who had come to help launch the new program. Caleb gave her an encouraging nod. With careful steps, Imani moved to the new table. Sarah, a girl with glasses and curly red hair, scooted over to make room. "Hey, Imani, are you doing the plant experiment too?" For the first time in months, Imani's lunch period was filled with conversation instead of silence. Ruth Ann watched from her post, occasionally catching Caleb's eye with a knowing smile. That afternoon, Imani practically bounced into the car after school. "Dad, Sarah asked if I want to be her science fair partner. Can I?" Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Of course you can, sweetheart." The next few days brought small but meaningful changes. Tuesday morning, Imani spent extra time picking out her clothes, not from anxiety, but excitement. She had plans to sit with her new friends again. "Sarah likes my braids," she told Caleb as he drove her to school. She said they look like beautiful patterns. The teachers had embraced the new support program with enthusiasm. Caleb received daily updates about diversity training sessions and student engagement activities. Mrs. Whitcomb even started a cultural exchange day where students could share traditions from their families. Wednesday at lunch, Ruth Ann made sure the children who had once teased Imani were seated separately, giving the new friendships room to grow. She kept a watchful eye, but her presence was gentle, more nurturing than authoritative. "Your daddy's done a wonderful thing," Ruth Ann told Imani quietly as she helped clean up a spilled milk carton. "Sometimes it just takes one person to help others see clearly." That evening, Caleb and Imani sat at their dinner table, the remains of chicken stir-fry on their plates. Imani was telling him about her science project plans, her hands moving animatedly as she explained about growing beans in different types of soil. "And Sarah said we can do the experiment at her house sometimes too. Her mom says it's okay." Imani bubbled with excitement. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Caleb replied, his heart full at seeing her so happy. "Oh, and guess what?" Imani continued, barely pausing for breath. "Marcus showed me his lunch today. He brings curry sometimes, just like I do. He said maybe we can trade lunches tomorrow." A laugh escaped Caleb's throat, not just at her enthusiasm, but at the pure joy of seeing his daughter finally feeling free to be herself at school. The sound of their shared laughter filled the kitchen, bouncing off the walls and wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Ruth Ann's words from lunch that day echoed. In his mind, sometimes it just takes one person. But looking at Imani's bright smile, Caleb knew it had taken many people, teachers willing to learn, children ready to be kind, and a lunch aide with a heart of gold. Most of all, it had taken Imani's own quiet courage to keep hoping for better days. "Dad?" Imani's voice brought him back to the moment. "Can we make cookies for my class next week? Mrs. Whitcomb said we can bring treats for the cultural exchange day." "Absolutely." Caleb smiled, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "We can make Grandma Rose's special recipe." More laughter bubbled up between them as they started planning their baking adventure, the kitchen filled with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, surrounded by people who see you for who you are. The remaining dinner dishes sat forgotten on the table as father and daughter moved to the couch, Imani excitedly drawing up plans for their cookie-baking project, while Caleb listened, thanking God silently for the sound of his daughter's happiness. Thursday morning had started with such promise. The sun painted warm stripes across the kitchen counter as Caleb packed Imani's favorite lunch, jollof rice with plantains, just the way she liked it. She had been smiling more lately, her shoulders relaxed, her voice carrying notes of joy that had been missing for too long. But when Caleb picked her up that afternoon, the change was immediate and jarring. Imani climbed into the back seat with careful movements, her backpack clutched close like a shield. The brightness in her eyes had dimmed. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Caleb asked, watching her in the rearview mirror. Imani smoothed her uniform skirt, a gesture he recognized as self-soothing. "Miss Whitcomb said I need to stop being so sensitive." Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What happened?" "During reading time, some kids were whispering about my hair again." Imani's voice got smaller. "I raised my hand like we're supposed to when someone's being disruptive. But Ms. Whitcomb said I should learn to ignore it because that's part of growing up." The car felt suddenly too warm. Caleb adjusted the air conditioning, buying time to steady his voice. "Did anything else happen?" "She made me stay after class. She said maybe I should try harder to fit in." Imani's fingers traced the pattern on her lunch bag. The food came back untouched again. When they got home, Caleb's phone pinged with an email notification. The sender was Darlene Whitcomb. His jaw clenched as he read. "Dear Mr. Thornton, I wanted to touch base regarding Imani's social challenges. While we appreciate her participation in class, there seems to be a pattern of oversensitivity to normal peer interactions. Perhaps we could discuss strategies to help her better integrate with her classmates. Best regards, Darlene Whitcomb." Caleb read the email 3 times, each word hitting like a small stone. The careful phrasing, the subtle shift of responsibility onto his 8-year-old daughter. It was masterfully done. He scheduled an immediate meeting with Principal Lockridge. The school halls were quiet by 4:30 when Caleb arrived. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors as he approached the administration office. Gerald P. Lockridge's office spoke of carefully curated authority, degrees mounted in perfect alignment, a desk too large for the space, and chairs positioned so visitors sat slightly lower than the principal himself. "Mr. Thornton." Lockridge stood, offering a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "I understand you have some concerns." "I do." Caleb remained standing until Lockridge gestured to a chair. "I'm troubled by how the school is handling incidents of bullying, particularly the suggestion that my daughter is the problem." Lockridge's expression shifted to one of practiced concern. "Now, bullying is quite a serious accusation. What we've observed are normal social adjustments. Children this age are learning to navigate relationships. By mocking other children's food and appearance?" Caleb kept his voice level. "Mr. Thornton." Lockridge leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "We've made significant accommodations already. The lunch seating arrangements, the student support program you've generously sponsored, but we must be careful not to create an oversensitive environment." The word choice wasn't accidental. Caleb noted how it echoed Ms. Whitcomb's email. "My daughter isn't being oversensitive. She's being targeted." That's a rather strong interpretation. Lockridge's tone carried a hint of warning. "We pride ourselves on maintaining harmony in our school community. Sometimes well-meaning parents can inadvertently escalate situations that would naturally resolve themselves." The threat was subtle but clear. Push too hard, and things could get worse. Caleb felt the familiar weight of institutional power settling around them, like dust. "I appreciate your time," Caleb said, standing. "But I want to be clear. Suggesting that an 8-year-old should simply endure mistreatment isn't maintaining harmony. It's enforcing silence." Lockridge's smile tightened. "We all want what's best for the children, Mr. Thornton. I hope you'll consider carefully how to proceed. Sometimes the most helpful approach is to let our experienced educators guide these situations." Walking back to his car, Caleb felt the full weight of what he'd witnessed. The polished offices, the careful language, the subtle warnings. It wasn't about protection at all. Every system in place served not to shield children from harm, but to shield the institution from accountability. He sat in his car, thinking of Imani's quiet prayers, her careful movements, her gentle spirit that somehow remained unbroken. The power dynamics were clear now, not just in the playground taunts or classroom dismissals, but in every carefully worded email and administrative response. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, to maintain order through silence, to preserve peace by demanding compliance from those who suffered, rather than addressing those who caused harm. As the afternoon light faded across the parking lot, Caleb understood with crushing clarity that this wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about every child who had learned to swallow their pain, every parent who had been politely dismissed, every voice that had been silenced in the name of harmony. The weight of this realization settled heavily in his chest as he started the car. He thought of Imani, waiting at home, probably drawing quietly at her desk, still believing in goodness despite everything. The steering wheel felt cold under his hands as he gripped it, understanding now that the real battle wasn't against obvious cruelty, but against the smooth, polished power that made silence feel safer than truth. The gentle hum of Friday evening settled over Caleb's home office as he sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear. Golden sunset light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. His friend Marcus, a fellow CEO who served on several school boards, listened patiently on the other end of the line. "There's an opening at Riverside Academy," Marcus said. "Their diversity initiatives are actually meaningful, not just talk. I could make a call." Caleb rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the week pressing down. "What's their approach to bullying?" "Zero tolerance, real consequences, not just lip service. Plus, their student support services are top-notch." Marcus paused. "Look, Caleb, I know you want to fight this, but sometimes the best thing for our kids is to get them somewhere safe." What neither man realized was that Imani stood frozen in the hallway, just outside the office door. She'd come down for a glass of water, her sock-covered feet silent on the stairs. Now her small hand gripped the doorframe, her heart beating faster as she listened. "Maybe you're right." Caleb sighed. "I just hate the idea of running from this, but Imani's well-being has to come first." A small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, made Caleb turn. Imani stood in the doorway, tears welling in her eyes. Her pink pajamas seemed too bright against her distressed expression. "Imani, sweetheart." Caleb started, quickly ending the call. "Please don't make me leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. Then, as if a dam had broken, words rushed out of her. "I don't want to go to a new school. I don't want to start over. I can't." Her shoulders shook as she tried to hold back sobs. Caleb crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling down to her level. Hey, it's okay. Nothing's decided. I was just talking. But you want me to leave." The force of her emotion surprised them both. "Everyone always wants me to leave when things get hard." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He remembered her file, the string of foster homes before him, each move labeled as "for the best." Each time, she'd been the one who had to adjust, to start over, to prove herself worthy of staying. Imani wrapped her arms around herself, something she did when she felt vulnerable. "I pray every night, Daddy, not just to be brave, but—" She took a shuddering breath. "I pray that someone will see what's happening, really see it, not just fix it by making me go away." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "Come here," he said softly, opening his arms. She hesitated, then stepped forward, letting him hold her. Her tears dampened his shirt. "I don't want to be rescued," she continued, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I want things to change, not just for me, for Jasmine too, and Marcus, and all the other kids who get treated different." He stroked her hair, the neat braids he'd learned to maintain himself. "But sweetheart, seeing you hurting, like this—" She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "Sometimes things hurt because they need to change, not because we need to run away." The simple truth of her words stopped him cold. Here he was, a successful businessman, used to solving problems with power and resources, and his 8-year-old daughter was teaching him about courage. "When did you get so wise?" he asked softly. A tiny smile flickered across her face. "I think God puts wisdom in our hearts when we need it most." Caleb stood, lifting her easily. "Let's get you back to bed. It's late." They walked upstairs together, the house quiet except for their footsteps and the distant hum of the heating system. In her room, surrounded by the soft purple walls and twinkling fairy lights they'd picked out together, Imani climbed into bed. Caleb tucked the blanket around her, then knelt beside the bed. "Imani," he said carefully, "I want you to know something. When I adopted you, I promised to protect you. Sometimes I get scared that I'm not doing that well enough." She reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture so tender it made his heart ache. "You protect me by being here, Daddy, by listening, by believing me." "I do believe you," he said firmly. "And I promise you this, we won't run. We'll stand together and face this, even when it's hard, even when it would be easier to walk away." He took her small hand in his. "We'll work to make things better, not just for you, but for everyone. It might take time, and it might not be easy, but we'll do it together." Imani's eyes shone with fresh tears, but these were different from before. "You promise?" "I promise." He squeezed her hand gently. "And you know what? Your prayers were answered. You are seen, not just by me, but by God. And He's given you such a beautiful heart that wants to help others, not just yourself." She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her whole face. "Can we pray together?" "Of course." They bowed their heads, and Imani's soft voice filled the quiet room. "Dear God, thank you for giving me a daddy who listens. Thank you for helping me be brave enough to tell the truth. Please help us make things better at school, not just for me, but for everyone. And please help Daddy be brave too. Amen." "Amen," Caleb echoed, his heart full. He stayed kneeling beside her bed long after her breathing evened out in sleep, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her chest. In the soft glow of her nightlight, he made another silent promise, not just to stand with her, but to learn from her. His daughter's courage wasn't in fighting or fleeing, but in staying present and hoping for change. She had shown him that true strength sometimes looked like an 8-year-old girl, praying not for escape, but for justice. Monday morning dawned with a crisp autumn chill. Caleb sat at his kitchen island, laptop open, watching Imani carefully spread peanut butter on her whole wheat toast. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he reviewed the email one final time. Subject: Request for district-wide forum on school climate and student dignity. His heart thumped against his ribs. This wasn't the typical donor communication filled with polite suggestions and careful diplomacy. This was different, raw, honest, necessary. Imani glanced up from her breakfast. "Dad, are you okay?" Caleb managed a small smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart." He clicked send before he could second-guess himself again. Within an hour, his phone started buzzing. First came the text from his public relations director, Sarah Chen. "We need to talk, ASAP." By 10 o'clock, he'd cleared his schedule for an emergency meeting in the company's main conference room. 5 of his most trusted advisors sat around the gleaming table, their faces etched with concern. "Caleb," Sarah began, her usually confident voice tentative. "I understand your intentions, but this forum, it's risky, very risky." Marcus Thompson, his legal counsel, nodded gravely. "The school board could view this as hostile action. Your position as a major donor, I'm not calling this forum as a donor." Caleb interrupted, his voice firm but quiet. "I'm calling it as a father, as a member of this community." "That's exactly what concerns us," said James Rivera, head of community relations. "You're one of the most prominent business leaders in this city. Everything you do carries weight. The district might see this as an attempt to strong-arm them." Caleb stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city sprawling below. "Maybe it's time we stopped worrying about how things look and started focusing on how things are." "The timing," Sarah pressed, "with the new education initiative launch next quarter. There will always be reasons to wait." Caleb turned back to face them. "Always something in the pipeline, always delicate relationships to protect. Meanwhile, children are hurting. My daughter is hurting, and she's not alone." The room fell silent. Caleb could feel the weight of their concern, their professional instincts to protect and manage and control the narrative. But he thought of Imani's quiet prayers, her careful movements, her brave smiles. "I've already sent invitations to every school board member, principal, and parent association president in the district," he said quietly. The press release goes out this afternoon. Sarah's shoulders slumped. At least let us help shape the message. The message is simple. We need to talk, honestly, about what's really happening in our schools. Throughout the day, responses trickled in. Some supportive, many cautious, a few openly hostile. Principal Lockridge's email was particularly pointed. While we appreciate your continued interest in school affairs, we must express concern about the potentially disruptive nature of such a forum. By late afternoon, local news outlets had picked up the story. Caleb's phone buzzed constantly, with messages from other parents, teachers, and community leaders. Some thanked him for taking a stand. Others warned him about making waves. The drive home that evening felt longer than usual. When he walked through the door, he found Imani sitting at the dining room table, homework spread out before her. She looked up with those wise eyes that sometimes made him forget she was only 8. "How was your day?" she asked, echoing his usual question. Caleb sat down beside her. Different. A little scary, actually. Imani set down her pencil. "Because of the meeting you're planning? I heard Mrs. Whitcomb talking about it." "What did she say?" Imani shrugged, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "She said sometimes people should leave well enough alone." Caleb felt that familiar surge of protective anger, but kept his voice gentle. "What do you think about that?" She was quiet for a long moment, fingers tracing the edge of her math worksheet. "Is telling the truth always scary?" The question hit him like a physical force. He thought about all the carefully worded emails he'd received that day, all the diplomatic warnings and professional concerns. Then he thought about his daughter's silent lunches and whispered prayers. "Yes," he answered honestly. "Sometimes telling the truth is very scary, especially when it's an important truth that might make people uncomfortable. Then how do you know when to do it?" Caleb reached over and covered her small hand with his. "Courage isn't about not being scared, sweetheart. It's about doing what's right, even when you are scared." Imani nodded slowly, processing this. "Like Daniel in the lion's den." "Exactly like that." He squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't facing the lions. It's opening the door to the den in the first place." Later that night, after Imani had gone to bed, Caleb sat at his desk, finalizing the forum details. The venue was secured. The Central Library's community room, neutral, ground. The date was set for 2 weeks away, giving everyone time to prepare, but not enough time to deflect indefinitely. He began sending out the formal invitations, each one addressed personally. To Principal Lockridge, to Mrs. Whitcomb, to Ruth Ann Calder, the kind lunchroom aide, to every parent who'd ever voiced a concern and been politely dismissed, to every teacher who might have more to say than their position allowed. With each click of the send button, he felt the tension building, not just in his shoulders, but in the very air around him. This wasn't just about Imani anymore. It wasn't even just about their school. This was about speaking truth in spaces where silence had become comfortable for some and crushing for others. He saved the last invitation for Tonya Reeves, remembering how her concerns had been dismissed at that parent meeting. Her response came almost immediately. "It's about time. Count me in." Caleb closed his laptop and walked quietly to Imani's room. She slept peacefully, her favorite stuffed giraffe tucked under one arm. He thought about how much courage it had taken for her to tell him the truth about school, to break that careful silence she'd built around herself. "You're braver than I am," he whispered, then gently closed her door. Chapter 12. The Forum, Scene 1. The school auditorium filled slowly on Tuesday evening, a quiet tension hanging in the air. Metal folding chairs creaked as parents, teachers, and administrators found their seats beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The space felt both too large and too small at the same time. Caleb sat in the front row, his hand wrapped protectively around Imani's smaller one. She wore her favorite yellow dress, her braids neat and precise, held together with yellow beads that clicked softly when she moved. Her other hand clutched a small notebook covered in rainbow stickers. "You okay, sweetheart?" Caleb whispered. Imani nodded, but her grip tightened on his hand. Up on the stage, Principal Lockridge adjusted the microphone stand, his usual confident smile looking strained. School board members lined up behind him in their formal attire, faces carefully neutral. The meeting began with standard procedural matters, but the rehearsed politeness couldn't mask the electricity in the room. When the floor opened for public comment, there was a moment of thick silence. Then Tonya Reeves stood up, the same mother Caleb had watched being dismissed at the previous meeting. Her voice shook slightly, but her words rang clear. "My son Marcus came home crying 3 times last week," she said. "Each time he begged me not to say anything because it would make things worse. What kind of message are we sending our children when staying quiet feels safer than speaking up?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Another parent stood up, then another. Stories spilled out like water through a breaking dam. A father described his daughter being excluded from birthday parties. A mother detailed how her son's complaints about bullying were labeled as overreacting. In the third row, Mrs. Chen, usually so reserved, spoke about her twins being mocked for their lunch choices. The teacher said they should bring more American food if they wanted to make friends. She said, her accent thick with emotion. "They are American. They were born here." Each story built on the last, creating a pattern impossible to ignore. Some parents cried as they spoke. Others trembled with barely contained anger. But all of them shared the same core truth. Their children had learned to endure rather than expect protection. Caleb felt Imani's hand squeeze his as Darlene Whitcomb walked slowly to the microphone. Her face was pale, and she gripped her notepad so tightly her knuckles showed white. The room fell silent. She started, then had to clear her throat. "I need to say something." She looked directly at Imani, then at Caleb. "I failed your daughter. I failed all these children." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she continued. "I saw what was happening. Every day I saw it. But I told myself it wasn't that bad, that speaking up would cause more problems, that keeping the peace was more important than—" Her voice broke. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Principal Lockridge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Darlene wasn't finished. "We talk about inclusion in our newsletters. We hang posters about kindness in our hallways. But when real moments come to stand up for these values, we—" She wiped her eyes. "I chose my comfort over their dignity, and I have to live with that." A tissue box passed from hand to hand through the audience. Even some of the school board members dabbed at their eyes. The carefully maintained facade of "everything is fine" crumbled in the face of such raw honesty. More teachers began to speak up. Mrs. Rodriguez from the 2nd grade admitted to witnessing similar incidents. Mr. Thompson from the cafeteria described how seating arrangements subtly reinforced social hierarchies. Each confession seemed to make the next one easier, as if truth itself was contagious. Caleb felt Imani sit up straighter beside him. Her face showed no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet relief that the weight of silence was finally lifting. He watched her shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. The school board president tried to wrap up the meeting with practiced phrases about reviewing policies and forming committees, but something unprecedented happened. People began to stand, first just a few, then dozens, then the entire room. They stood not in protest or anger, but in silent acknowledgement of all that had been spoken, and all that still needed to change. Imani stood too, her small frame straight and dignified. Caleb rose beside her, their hands still joined. Across the room, Darlene Whitcomb's tears had dried, and she stood with her head high, finally choosing courage over comfort. The truth hung in the air, impossible to deny or diminish. In that moment of standing together, something shifted, not just in policy or procedure, but in hearts. The warm weight of Imani's hand in his reminded Caleb that sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting power with power, but simply refusing to let truth remain buried. No one spoke. No one needed to. The room remained standing, hundreds of people bound together in silent witness to this moment of reckoning and, perhaps, the beginning of real change. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Imberfield Elementary, casting long shadows across empty hallways that would soon fill with children's voices. But today felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, as if the truth spoken the night before had cleared away years of stagnant silence. Caleb sat in his home office, reviewing emails that had flooded in since the forum. His coffee grew cold beside him as he read message after message. Parents sharing their own stories, teachers offering anonymous tips, community members expressing support. His phone buzzed with a news alert. School district launches full investigation into discrimination claims. He rubbed his tired eyes, remembering the faces from last night. So many parents had stood up, their voices trembling at first, then growing stronger as they spoke. Maria Gutierrez describing how her son's Spanish was mocked in class. James Chen detailing the casual racism his daughters endured. Tonya Reeves, who had tried to raise concerns before, finally being heard. The district superintendent's office called at 9 o'clock sharp. "Mr. Thornton, we've initiated a formal investigation," the superintendent said, her voice carrying both authority and concern. "Our preliminary findings are troubling. We're bringing in an independent review board." "Thank you," Caleb replied simply. "What happens next?" "We've already received Gerald Lockridge's resignation letter. It was waiting in my inbox this morning." Caleb thought of the principal's carefully crafted expressions of concern, his masterful deflections. All that polished evasion couldn't stand in the light of truth. "And the new policies?" he asked. "We're announcing them today. Mandatory cultural competency training for all staff, monthly parent oversight meetings, clear reporting procedures for incidents, and a complete review of how we've handled past complaints." Later that morning, Caleb attended an emergency meeting at the school. The assistant principal, now acting head of the school, looked shell-shocked but determined. Teachers filled the room, some appearing defensive, others relieved. When discussion turned to special accommodations for Imani, Caleb stood up. "No," he said firmly. "My daughter doesn't need special treatment. Every child in this school deserves to feel safe. Every child deserves to be seen and heard. That's not special treatment. It's basic human dignity." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Miss Whitcomb, who had spoken so honestly at the forum, wiped tears from her eyes and nodded. Throughout the day, Caleb received updates. The district's Human Resources Department was reviewing staff complaints that had been previously buried. The school board scheduled an emergency session to approve funding for new training programs. Parent volunteers began organizing committees to oversee lunchroom supervision and playground monitoring. When Caleb picked up Imani that afternoon, she climbed into the car with a small smile. "Jenny asked if she could sit with me at lunch today," she said quietly. "And Mrs. Calder made sure everyone was being nice." "That's good," Caleb replied, watching her in the rearview mirror. "How do you feel?" Imani thought for a moment, folding her hands in her lap. "Like I can breathe better," she said finally. "Like the air isn't so heavy anymore." At home that evening, they made dinner together, chopping vegetables for a stew. Imani hummed softly as she worked, something she hadn't done in months. The sound filled their kitchen with a gentle peace. "Daddy," she said, carefully placing carrots in neat rows. "Remember when you said sometimes doing the right thing is scary?" "I do. I think it was scary for everyone last night. But good scary. Like when you're about to go down a big slide and your tummy feels funny, but then you do it anyway and it turns out fun." Caleb smiled, touched by her wisdom. "That's exactly right, sweetheart." After dinner, Imani did her homework without the usual tension in her shoulders. She changed into her favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny stars all over them, and climbed into bed without hesitation. "Will you read me a story?" she asked, snuggling under her covers. Caleb sat beside her and opened her chosen book. As he read, he noticed how relaxed she was, how her breathing grew steady and deep. By the third page, she had drifted off to sleep. He set the book aside and watched her peaceful face in the soft glow of her nightlight. Her features were completely at rest, untroubled by tomorrow's worries. Her small hand lay open on the pillow, no longer clenched as it had been so many nights before. Standing in her doorway, Caleb felt the weight of what had begun. Change wouldn't happen overnight. There would be resistance, setbacks, hard conversations ahead. But something fundamental had shifted. The truth had been spoken aloud, and once spoken, it couldn't be unheard. He thought of all the children who would benefit from these changes, not just Imani, but countless others who had suffered in silence. Children who would now have voices to speak for them, adults who would stand up instead of looking away. Imani stirred slightly in her sleep, turning over with a soft sigh. Caleb watched her a moment longer, his heart full of quiet gratitude. The moonlight painted silver patterns on her wall, and in the peaceful silence of her room he could feel the first gentle stirrings of real change taking root. 3 days after the school-wide forum, sunlight streamed through the windows of Imani's bedroom as she got ready for school. There was something different about her movements this morning, a lightness, an ease that hadn't been there before. She hummed softly while arranging her braids, no longer concerned about them being too much. "Ready for breakfast?" Caleb called from the kitchen, where the smell of French toast filled the air. "Coming, Dad?" Her voice carried a brightness that made his heart swell. At the table, Imani didn't just eat. She chatted. She talked about the science project she was excited to start, and wondered aloud if they'd get to choose their own lab partners. The change in her was subtle but profound, like a flower slowly unfurling its petals in the morning sun. "You know," she said, carefully cutting her French toast into neat squares, "Mrs. Martinez is going to be our interim principal until they find someone new." Caleb nodded, remembering the capable vice principal who had always shown genuine concern for student welfare. "What do you think about that?" "She came to our class yesterday and talked to everyone. She said we're all going to learn together how to make our school better." Imani's fork paused midway to her mouth. "She looked right at me when she said it, Dad. Not like I was a problem, but like I helped make things better." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "You did help make things better, sweetheart. Your courage helped a lot of people find their voice." The morning drive to school felt different too. The tension that had previously filled the car was gone, replaced by Imani's gentle humming along with the radio. As they pulled up to the drop-off area, she didn't hesitate or clutch her backpack like a shield. "Have a great day," Caleb said, watching her hop out of the car. "You too, Dad," she waved, her smile genuine and bright. Later that day, Caleb returned to the school during lunch period. This time, he wasn't there to investigate or intervene. He simply wanted to see how things were changing. He found a quiet spot near the cafeteria entrance where he could observe without being noticed. The lunchroom had a different energy now. Teachers and aides moved among the tables with greater attention and purpose. He spotted Darlene Whitcomb, who had requested to keep her teaching position after her emotional testimony at the forum. She was actively engaging with students now, stopping at different tables to check in, her previous passive stance replaced by genuine involvement. Ruth Ann Calder stood at her usual post, but her shoulders seemed lighter, her smile more frequent. She had been one of the few who had always tried to help, even when the system made it difficult. Now she moved through the room with renewed purpose, her kindness no longer a solitary effort, but part of a larger commitment to change. When Imani entered the cafeteria with her lunch tray, Caleb held his breath out of habit. But this time, something beautiful happened. "Imani!" A girl with curly red hair waved from a table near the middle of the room. "We saved you a seat." Caleb watched as his daughter's face lit up. She walked to the table where 3 other girls sat, including Sarah Chen, who had spoken up at the forum about her own experiences with bullying. The girls shifted their chairs to make room, creating a space that was clearly meant for Imani. As she settled into her seat, Imani carefully set down her tray. The same lunch he had packed that morning, leftovers from their favorite Ethiopian restaurant, sat before her. Without hesitation or shame, she folded her hands and bowed her head to say, "Grace," just as she did at home. Ruth Ann Calder, passing by their table, paused to watch with a warm smile. Her eyes met Caleb's across the room for just a moment, and she gave a small, knowing nod before continuing her rounds. "Is that Doro what?" Sarah asked, peering at Imani's lunch with interest. "My cousin loves that." "Yeah." Imani's voice carried clearly across the cafeteria. "My dad and I love it too. Want to try some?" The simple offer, to share food that had once been mocked, brought a lump to Caleb's throat. He watched as Imani carefully tore off a piece of injera bread and showed her friends how to scoop up the stew. "This is amazing!" the red-haired girl exclaimed. "Could you teach me how to make it?" Imani laughed, a clear, joyful sound that seemed to float above the cafeteria noise. "I'm still learning how to cook it myself, but my dad's getting really good at it. Maybe we could all try making it together sometime." The girls eagerly nodded, and the conversation flowed naturally to other topics: homework, their favorite music, plans for the weekend. Imani wasn't just included. She was an active part of the group, her voice mixing equally with the others. From his unobtrusive spot, Caleb watched his daughter bloom in real time. She wasn't hiding or shrinking or carefully measuring her words. She was simply being herself, the bright, thoughtful girl he had always known her to be. When she laughed again at something Sarah said, the sound carried no trace of the careful restraint that had bounded her joy for so long. This was what justice looked like. Caleb realized, not just in policy changes and new leadership, but in the small, precious moments of children being free to be themselves. It wasn't perfect. There would still be challenges and hard days ahead. But the foundation had shifted. The silence had been broken, and in its place, laughter rang out like bells of hope. As he quietly left the cafeteria, Caleb carried with him the image of his daughter's unguarded smile and the sound of her laughter mixing with her friends. The fear and helplessness that had haunted his own lunch period visits was replaced by something stronger, joy, and the knowledge that standing up for truth, no matter how difficult, could create real change. The simple sound of Imani's laughter over lunch meant more than any corporate success he'd ever achieved. It was the sound of healing, of belonging, of a promise kept not just to his daughter, but to every child who deserved to be seen, heard, and celebrated for exactly who they were. The kitchen was filled with the warm glow of evening light as Imani sat at the table, her pencil moving carefully across lined paper. Her pink eraser sat unused beside her hand. She seemed sure of every word she wrote. Caleb noticed how different she looked from just weeks ago, her shoulders relaxed and her expression peaceful as she worked on her homework. "What are you writing about, sweetheart?" Caleb asked, setting down 2 glasses of milk and a plate of chocolate chip cookies between them. Imani looked up with a small smile. "Miss Thompson asked us to write about what kindness and bravery mean to us," she said, reaching for a cookie. "She said we could write it like a letter if we wanted to." Caleb sat down beside her, warming at the mention of the new teacher who had replaced Ms. Whitcomb. "That sounds like an interesting assignment. Would you like to share it when you're done?" "Yes, please." Imani nodded, then bent back over her paper with careful focus. As she wrote, Caleb watched her face change with her thoughts, sometimes serious, sometimes soft with memory. Her braids, tied with yellow ribbons that morning, swayed gently as she worked. He could see her mouthing words silently as she wrote them, something she often did during prayer. Finally, Imani set down her pencil and straightened the paper. "I'm finished," she said quietly. "Would you like to read it now?" "I'd love to," Caleb replied, accepting the paper she held out to him. Her handwriting was neat and precise, each letter carefully formed. He began to read. "Dear friend, I used to think being brave meant not being scared. I thought being kind meant always smiling, even when things hurt inside. But I learned something important this year. Sometimes being brave means telling the truth when your voice shakes. Sometimes it means standing still when you want to run away. And sometimes it means letting other people be brave with you. My daddy taught me that kindness isn't just about being nice. Real kindness means seeing when something is wrong and helping fix it. Not just for yourself, but for everybody. Even when it's hard. I pray every night, and God helps me be strong. But He also sent me people who stand beside me, like Ruth Ann, who saves me a seat at lunch and smiles at me like she really sees me, like my new friends who ask about my food instead of making fun of it, and most of all, like my daddy who taught me that love means fighting for what's right. I learned that sometimes you have to let your heart be brave before your mind stops being scared. And that's okay, because bravery isn't about not having fear, it's about doing what's right anyway. Now when I say grace at lunch, I pray out loud. I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. And I think that's what kindness and bravery really mean, helping everyone feel safe to be themselves. Love, Imani. Caleb had to blink several times as he finished reading. His daughter's words struck deep in his heart, showing wisdom beyond her years. He looked at Imani, who was watching him with gentle eyes. "This is beautiful, sweetheart," he said softly. "May I keep it?" Imani nodded. "I made an extra copy for Ms. Thompson. This one's for you." Caleb stood up and walked to his home office, aware of Imani following quietly behind him. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather folder where he kept his most important papers. With deliberate care, he placed Imani's letter inside. "Why are you putting it there, Daddy?" Imani asked, curious. Caleb knelt down to meet her eyes. "Because this letter is one of the most important things I own now. It reminds me of something I learned from you." "What did you learn?" "I learned that real leadership isn't about having power or being the loudest voice in the room. It's about listening to the quiet voices that need to be heard. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." He touched the folder gently. "Your words here, they changed me, Imani. They made me a better person." Imani wrapped her arms around his neck in a tight hug. "You were already good, Daddy. You just needed to be brave, too." Caleb held his daughter close, marveling at how much she had taught him about courage and grace. The letter in his desk wasn't just paper and ink. It was a testament to the power of truth spoken in love, of faith that moved mountains, and of the wisdom that sometimes came in the smallest packages. As they pulled apart, Imani yawned, and Caleb realized it was getting late. "Time for bed, sweetheart. Would you like to say your prayers together tonight?" "Yes, please," she answered, taking his hand as they walked toward her bedroom, leaving behind the letter that would forever remind them both of how far they'd come and how love could transform fear into strength. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of the Hope Community Center, casting warm rectangles of light across the worn wooden floor. Caleb Thornton watched from near the craft table as his daughter, Imani, approached a group of new children with confident steps. Her braids swayed gently as she walked, adorned with the colorful beads she had chosen herself that morning. "Hi, I'm Imani," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the room. "Would you like to make friendship bracelets with me?" Two girls looked up from their coloring books, and a boy with glasses set down his puzzle piece. Their faces brightened at her invitation. "Really? I've never made one before," the boy admitted. Imani's smile widened. "That's okay. I can show you how. My dad got us lots of string in different colors." Caleb's heart swelled as he watched her pull out chairs for her new friends, carefully explaining how to measure and braid the threads. Just months ago, she would have stayed close to his side, speaking in whispers. Now her laughter mixed freely with the other children's voices. Mrs. Martinez, the center's director, appeared beside him with a stack of construction paper. "Your daughter has such a beautiful spirit," she said softly. "The other children naturally gravitate to her kindness. She's teaching me more than I could ever teach her," Caleb replied, thinking back to the letter she had written, now safely stored in his desk drawer at home. Its simple words had changed everything. Being brave isn't about being strong all by yourself. It's about helping others find their strength too. Around them, the community center hummed with Sunday afternoon activity. Elderly volunteers sorted donated books, while teenagers helped younger kids with homework. A father and son worked together to fix a wobbly table leg. None of the fancy marble floors or expensive furniture from his corporate office existed here, but something far more valuable filled this space: genuine human connection. "You know," Mrs. Martinez continued, arranging art supplies, "when you first offered to sponsor our weekend programs, I worried it might just be another wealthy businessman trying to look good for the papers." Caleb nodded, understanding her initial skepticism. "I used to think writing checks was enough," he admitted. "That money could fix everything." "But that's not why you're here every Sunday, is it?" "No," he said quietly, watching Imani demonstrate a particularly tricky knot to her new friends. "I'm here because my daughter showed me that real change happens when we stop trying to solve problems from above and start sitting beside people instead." A small girl in pigtails approached Imani's table, clutching a half-finished bracelet. "I messed up," she said, lower lip trembling. Imani gently took the tangled threads. "That's okay. Sometimes we have to undo things to make them right. Here, let me help you start again." Caleb remembered his own learning curve, how his first instinct had been to throw money and power at the school's problems. But Imani's quiet courage had taught him that true leadership meant listening to the smaller voices, standing in uncomfortable truths, and being willing to start over when necessary. The afternoon light shifted, painting the walls in soft orange hues. Children began packing up their crafts as parents arrived. Imani helped clean up the table, making sure every piece of string was properly stored for next week. "Dad," she called, "can we pray before we go, like we always do?" "Of course, sweetheart." The remaining families naturally gathered around as Imani bowed her head. There was no hesitation in her voice now, no fear of being seen or heard. "Dear God," she began, "thank you for this beautiful day and for all our new friends. Thank you for teaching us that love is stronger than fear, and that every person deserves to be treated with kindness. Help us remember to be brave, not just for ourselves but for others too. And thank you for showing us that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. Amen. Amen. Caleb echoed, along with the others around them. In that moment, surrounded by community and bathed in sunset light, he felt the profound truth of how far they'd come. The peace that filled him wasn't the shallow satisfaction of problems solved through power. It was deeper, richer, built on foundations of authentic understanding and shared humanity. As they gathered their belongings to leave, Imani hugged Mrs. Martinez goodbye. "See you next Sunday," she called out cheerfully to her new friends, who waved enthusiastically in return. Walking to their car hand in hand, Caleb realized that true transformation hadn't come from his wealth or influence. It had come from choosing to see what was happening in that school lunchroom, from listening to the pain beneath his daughter's silence, and from standing firm in the face of resistance. Most importantly, it had come from following Imani's lead, her unwavering faith that things could change if people were brave enough to face the truth together. The evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Imani squeezed his hand and looked up at him, with eyes full of contentment and peace. In them, he saw reflected all the hope and healing that comes when we choose to build bridges instead of walls, when we learn to stand not in power, but in love. This was the higher peace they had found, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose. Not the silence of fear, but the quiet confidence of knowing they were exactly where they needed to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.